Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another edition of our Operational Reality with Rocco Million live on my group, Nonpartisans for Progress. If you haven't done so already, please join and follow the group. Help me make it a revolutionary voice to empower, to educate and empower the public. That's our mission. The last few days I've been, focusing on our for-profit imperialism and our proxy wars. And unfortunately, so many people in our society have just, they ignore reality, they ignore historical facts. And they just buy up the mainstream lies and narratives, without even critical thought, without even thinking things through. It's almost as if they want to believe these mainstream narratives and lies so that they could live in a delusion and become indifferent to the human suffering, the pointless human suffering that ensues. Talking about Syria real quick, we defeat this cognitive dissonance by interjecting the simple logic of our operational reality and historical facts. So you show somebody, hey, you think Syria is somehow different than our hundreds of other for-profit proxy wars throughout history. We have teamed up with right-wing terrorist groups worldwide in proxy wars against leftist movements, to protect our for-profit way of life in America, because we're a right-wing government in America. We have a right-wing neoliberal oligarchy, ruling class. So that's a right-wing government. We've been teaming up with right-wing proxies all over the world against leftist movements, whether it be during the Vietnam War in Cambodia with Pol Pot, or Iran back in the 50s. It was a democratic state, not subject to Sharia law. America got involved because they wanted to nationalize their oil interests, and Britain had their oil company there. They didn't like that, and so they, basically installed the Shah of Iran, and it became religious. He ended up getting booted too, but now because of America's meddling, Iran is way worse off than it was, and much more of a threat to everyone than it was because of America's meddling in the region. Installing right-wing dictators and terrorists, to make sure governments and don't go to the left and work for their people and public purpose. That's what this is all about. So you got to tell them, look at South America. We teamed up with the right-wing FARC in Colombia. We teamed up with the right-wing Pinochet in Honduras. We teamed up with the right-wing Contras in Nicaragua. It goes on and on. We teamed up with the right-wing Taliban in Afghanistan. And now we're teamed up with the right-wing Karzai brothers and warlords and drug traffickers. We're proxy, we're allies with right-wing governments like Saudi Arabia, who are under Sharia law, and we're trying to take out Syria, who's a democratic state, whose people have a constitution and have constitutional rights, and they're not subject to the craziness of Sharia law. Yeah, it makes no sense. And so America is actually funding, arming, and training right-wing religious nutcases, terrorist groups, to go and destabilize Syria like we always do throughout history. And they say, oh no, we're funding the white helmets and we're just helping the oppressed. Since when does America do that? Look at the historical record. Don't ignore our reality. That's how you become indifferent to pointless human suffering. Look at our reality. Like I said, we've teamed up with right-wing groups hundreds and hundreds of times. But all of a sudden, you think now we're teamed up with a left-wing humanitarian group? No. No. We're the white helmets, like Tulsi showed, the people of Syria, pictures of the white helmets who are supposedly the good guys, and the Syrian people had no idea who they were. They recognized them as ISIS, foreign fighters who are terrorizing the Sharia people, the Syrian people, and wanting them to live under Sharia law. They hate the Syrian people because they have a democracy and equal rights. That's the deal. And when you understand that, it's much harder than to ignore our reality and to, rationalize away the systemic abuse and rationalize away, for-profit imperialism and our proxy wars. So that's our job as progressives, is to keep interjecting this logic wherever it's needed. Today, I got a great article to read from about our right-wing neoliberal status quo. But before we do that, I want to describe our public purpose and our social contract. Because when we're talking about the American story, it should always begin with, our social contract, our Constitution. It mandates that our government be for, of, and by the people. All right, to provision the general welfare and the common defense, to ensure domestic tranquility. So, in other words, we are guaranteed a socially owned government for the public purpose per the Constitution. The preamble to the Constitution mandates that our government promote the general welfare and common defense to ensure domestic tranquility. That's in our social contract. Article 1, Section 8 takes it even a step further, and it mandates that our government mint and tax to provide for that general welfare and common defense thereof. All right, so what does this mean? This means that our government necessarily needs essential real resources, like a military to, defend us from rogue nations or, anybody, any enemy that would want to do our people harm and violate our people's rights. We need a military. We need legal systems for the same purpose. We need infrastructure, roads, sewer systems, sanitation systems. We need green, sustainable energy. That's an essential public good. That's vital to the general welfare and domestic tranquility, because we don't want to be depleting our natural resources and poisoning ourselves in the process. Also, the 1% can make a profit. That's ridiculous. Our government never needs profit or revenue. It makes dollars by law from thin air per Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And it's mandated to provide all these essential public goods and resources, for the general welfare, to ensure domestic tranquility. All right, so that's government's job. So government needs to get all these real resources. Another one is like top-notch healthcare and education for all. A lot of people disagree this is government's job, but it absolutely is. Because think about it, how could you ever have domestic tranquility without healthy, smart populations? If you have diseased, sick, miserable, uneducated populations, they're not going to be able to produce our needs of tomorrow. And so that's incompatible with domestic tranquility. It's incompatible with the general welfare of society. So this is an essential public good that everyone needs. It's not about free stuff. This is about government satisfying its public purpose and working for domestic tranquility. And, nowhere in the Constitution does it say our government's supposed to work for the private profits of the 1%. at the expense of its public purpose. It doesn't say that. We are like Ellis Winningham, an economist that I learned a lot from. He says this often, a socially owned government like ours is mandated to work for the public purpose and let the individual make what they can from the balanced economy that creates. A socially owned government is never supposed to work for the private purpose of the individual and for society to make do with the scraps. That's fascism. That's trickled down like our right-wing neoliberal status quo right now. And this inflicts, makes more people suffer and die needlessly under artificial scarcity, than wars and guns and drugs combined. In fact, artificial scarcity is the main driver for wars combined. But people don't want to understand this. Nobody even blinks an eye at this status quo stuff. They ignore the reality. We rationalize away or ignore systemic abuse. We ignore evil committed in our name so that we could sleep easy, and not have to think about all the horrible stuff going on. We don't want to believe that. When we think about the truth, when we're confronted with our actual operational reality, and those delusions are destroyed with simple logic, well, this causes cognitive dissonance. You get sick to your stomach. You want to punch somebody in the face. So people avoid that. But you know what? It's our job to force them to not overlook millions of people made to suffer and die needlessly. It's our job to force them to confront our reality and take a position on the brutality of that reality. And then when they take an inhumane position, they should be shunned and criticized until they rectify their socially offensive position. That's how democracy works. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a PhD. I'm simply a disabled vet trying to participate in our democracy because that's the only way democracy even works. Okay, everybody, we all need to start standing up and speaking out. Anybody can do what I'm doing from your living room, or when you're out and about on the town, and you hear somebody punching down or blaming the victim, using the mainstream lies and scare tactics that keep us divided and fighting against our own public interest. It's up to us to interject the simple logic of our operational reality. Okay. For instance, the big one that they use is about taxation, and they say that, well, not even that. Well, the big one, the scare tactic that they use to punch down on poor people and unemployed people. And they'll say, oh, those lazy unemployed people, why don't they just go out and get a job? Anybody could work themselves out of poverty. This is ignoring the reality, ignoring the brutality of our reality, ignoring systemic abuse and thinking personal responsibility or job training can somehow solve a systemic abuse. It can't. All right, because when our government targets 5% unemployment like it does, it doesn't matter if every worker has the best job skills and every worker has the most motivation to work. Our government targets 5% unemployment, so we would still be forcing millions of people to be poor and unemployed. That's a systemic abuse that can't be fixed by personal responsibility. So we got to force people to deal with that reality, not let them, live in a delusion and think that unemployed people are just lazy or people on food stamps or welfare are just gaming the system. Because I'm here to tell you, nobody can game the system on food stamps. I don't care what it looks like, even if it looks like it's an able-bodied person getting food stamps. They are a victim of class warfare by our government, creating wage stagnation and starvation wage environments. So that person can't work full time and feed his family. So, you can't knock him for trying to survive the best way he can. And if that's getting government assistance and living on the black market, well, that's not his fault. That's the systemic abuses that we allow collectively to be inflicted on us as a society. We do not enforce this social contract that you see next to me. You could have all the rights in the world. If you don't enforce them, they're worthless. Okay, that's the point. We're guaranteed a socially owned government for the public purpose, but if we allow that government to work for the private purpose of capital at the expense of everybody else, we're going to get fascism every time, regardless. That's why it's so important we keep standing up and interjecting this logic. All right. Also, with the status quo thing, with the trickle down thing, while we're talking about this, and I remember there's another scare tactic and lie that they use to keep us accepting artificial scarcity of a natural rate of unemployment. And they'll tell us that oh wait, I just lost my place. No, that's okay. But anyway, so this cognitive dissonance needs to be confronted. Oh yeah, and they said trickle down. Trickle down. People agree with it. Even people like Chris Cuomo, right now, they say we have a great economy. They say if 4% unemployment, even though that's a bogus number, we have, but even at 4%, even if that was real, that would still be millions of people unemployed and poor. And people like Chris Cuomo and other Democrats even will say we have a good economy. That's bullshit. We have nowhere close to a good economy. Trickle down leaves the bottom income distribution the first to be fired in an economic downturn and the last to be hired in an economic uptick. All right, so that quite simply it leaves the bottom income distribution the last in a constant state of depression, recession, a constant state of pain, living under artificial scarcity. And the bottom income distribution is the biggest segment of society. So there's no way that could be consistent with the general welfare or with the public interest. All right, that would never be in the public interest. That's the exact opposite way of domestic tranquility. Trickle down, it's completely illogical too. And we use simple logic to destroy it real quick. Right now, because of our trickle down from the 70s, we have all these starvation wage environments and jobs because our government from the 70s has been targeting unemployment and forcing millions to be unemployed and poor. That gives capital a weapon to wage war on labor and labor wages and labor working conditions. Because now the boss don't have to give you that raise. They have millions of people outside that government forces to be unemployed and poor. They're so desperate that they'll work for starvation wages under horrible conditions. So that drives all our wages down. That's why our wages have been stagnant from the 70s, while our productivity and our corporate and our cost of living are at record highs. All right, so that means over time, the majority don't have no disposable income to spend. Our production's up sky high, and our wages are stagnant from the 70s. That means there's tons of production, tons of supply, but no demand in the economy to buy it. So we are all then forced into private credit just to consume production and survive. And because private credit always dries up, that leads to booms, busts, and bailouts that only and then government always must move into a huge deficit position anyway to bail out the rich. It's sadistic artificial scarcity. It's untapped productive capacity. So the people on welfare are not gaming the system. Okay, they are being subjected to class warfare in the form of starvation wages, because our government keeps a buffer stock of unemployed people for capital to wage war on labor wages. That drives all labor wages down. If you got millions of people outside unemployed, they're going to be so desperate that they're always willing to undercut you and work for starvation wages. Get it? So that the real people that are gaming the system is the 1% and our American oligarchs. And we need to get over our cognitive dissonance. We need to make people reevaluate their previously held positions and beliefs, but through the lens of our actual operational reality. We can't let them live in a delusion and rationalize away systemic abuse and evil committed in our name. We can't do it. So government's job is to provision society with these essential public goods and resources. That's the only way it could satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare of society, to provision the common defense and ensure domestic tranquility. And how does it get those real resources? From the beginning, well, it has to impose a tax on the private sector. When it imposes tax on us in the private sector, that instantly creates unemployment. Now we're all willing to sell our goods and labor for dollars to survive, pay our tax, and stay out of jail. All right, that's how government then has people to provision society with all those needed, essential, real resources using paid employment. So that's what it's all about. Taxation doesn't fund the federal government. Taxation doesn't fund spending. Taxation is used to drive demand for the dollar. Government imposes tax to guarantee demand for the dollar. In other words, it imposes tax to create unemployment. That ensures everybody needs dollars, and merchants will now accept dollars as a common means of exchange because they know, enough people will always need dollars to pay fines, fees, and taxes. So dollars will always be in demand. So that's the primary reason for taxation, is to create unemployment, so that government can provision society with a military and infrastructure, legal systems, sanitation systems, top-notch healthcare and education, green sustainable energy, you name it, using paid employment. So taxation and spending is just a social construct. Dollars are just a law to satisfy tax. We can't run out of laws, so we can't run out of dollars. Only the things we buy with dollars can limit us. All right, so the money part of the equation is always infinite for our government. All that matters is our government deficits spends enough to make the required investments into our society and productive capacity to ensure enough real resources are created and available for any money to buy. That's the general welfare. That's its purpose. And that's all that matters here. When we buy into these lies and scare tactics, like, we have the government's broke and we have to find tax revenues or borrow money from China, it's complete BS to get us to accept artificial scarcity. Okay, if you think that we have to tax the rich before government can spend and do its job, well, now you're going to accept government not doing its job until it taxes the rich and gets more revenue. And because government never needs revenue, all dollars are made by law from thin air at will by congressional decree. That's artificial scarcity. We don't got to wait to tax the rich, and government never borrows dollars, especially from China or anyone else. Only Congress can mint and tax. It's right in the Constitution. So the fact of the matter is, you can't even collect a tax. You can't even sell a bond until government first spends dollars into existence. Okay, so it's completely illogical to think taxes or bond sales somehow fund our government. It's impossible. Money always needs to be issued first before taxes can be collected or bonds can be sold. All right, it's just that simple. That's how we defeat these mainstream lies. That's how we overcome cognitive dissonance and make people reevaluate previously held positions and beliefs through the lens of our reality instead of their delusion created in fantasy by the mainstream. Okay, so now moving on. All right, so this is neoliberalism, the ideology at the root of all our problems. Financial meltdown, environmental disaster, and even the rise of Donald Trump. Neoliberalism has played its part in them all. Why has the left failed to come up with an alternative? This is by George Monbiot. I'm not sure how to say his name, but it's again, this is in The Guardian, and it starts off by saying, imagine if the people of the Soviet Union had never heard of communism. The ideology that dominates our lives has, for the most part, no name. Mention it in conversation, and you'll be rewarded with a shrug. Even if your listeners have heard the term before, they will struggle to define neoliberalism. Do you know what it means? Its anonymity is both a symptom and the cause of its power. It has played a major role in remarkable variety of crises, from the financial meltdown of 2007 and 8, the offshoring of wealth and power, of which the Panama Papers offer us merely a glimpse, the slow collapse of public health and education, the resurgence of child poverty, the epidemic of loneliness, the collapse of ecosystems, the rise of Donald Trump. But we respond to these crises as if they emerge in isolation, apparently unaware that they have all been either catalyzed by or exacerbated by the same coherent philosophy, a philosophy that has or had a name. What greater power can there be than to operate namelessly? Inequality is recast as virtuous. The market ensures that everybody gets what they deserve. So pervasive as neoliberalism became that we seldom even recognize it as an ideology. We appear to accept the proposition that this utopian Millerian faith describes a neutral force, a kind of biological law, like Darwin's theory of evolution. But the philosophy arose as a conscious attempt to reshape human life and shift the focus of power. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. It maintains that the market delivers benefits that can never be achieved by planning. Okay, that's just complete bullshit because the markets are only currency users. The markets can't make dollars. So if government doesn't plan and spend and tax and regulate, then there is no market. So the market can never be more efficient than planning. Attempts to limit competition are treated as inimical to liberty. Tax and regulation should be minimized. Public services should be privatized. The organization of labor and collective bargaining by trade unions are portrayed as market distortions that impede the formation of natural hierarchy of winners and losers. Yeah, I'll bet. And the biggest collective bargaining power that there was for labor by far was the full employment policies of the New Deal. When you have full employment, you have a situation where there's more jobs than people available. Now business has to compete, and your wages rise. Business will hire you straight out of high school and give you a great career that you could raise a family with one income. That's a good business environment. But anyway, neoliberals, they see attempts to limit competition are treated as antithetical to liberty. Tax and regulation should be minimized. Public services should be privatized. The organization of labor and collective bargaining by trade unions are portrayed as market distortions that impede the formation of natural hierarchy of winners and losers. And again, that's because like something like the federal job guarantee, for instance, gives more collective bargaining power to labor than any union could ever dream of. And of course, capital don't want that because, that makes their wages rise. That gives them their fair share of our nation's wealth. And so it takes away the leverage from the capitalists to, enforce starvation wages on us and horrible working conditions, exploitive working conditions. So, but they're seen as market distortions. Inequality is recast as virtuous, a reward for utility, and a generator of wealth, which trickles down to enrich everyone. So it says, inequality under neoliberalism, inequality is recast as virtuous, a reward for utility, and a generator of wealth, which trickles down to enrich everyone. Efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive. The market ensures everyone gets what they deserve. You see how sadistic this ideology is? Any attempt to make a more just society is seen as evil and unsustainable. And it's insane because they act like any intervention is bad. But again, there is no economy without the government. It's the government that's the supreme authority of our economy and society as the currency issuer. And, it owns the private sector completely with its ability to impose tax and be the monopoly issuer of the only tax credit, dollars. So again, it's just like communist China in a way. Nobody in America even owns land. We all pay rent. We all pay tax. See? And the only free market is the black market. Even the dollars in your pocket belong to the government, and they're subject to recall at any time per the Constitution. It's taxation. So, you're only allowed to spend the government's dollars on the government-regulated economy, buying government-regulated goods and services. So these people that think the market is more efficient and the market knows best, they completely don't understand our operational reality. They live in a fantasy, and that's why it's up to us to tell them this. Trickle down can't balance an economy. You could give the rich all the money in the world. They can invest all they want in their business. They can make the very best products in the world. Okay. If nobody could buy their production, they're always going to go out of business. So the rich are not the job creators. The rich can't create permanent jobs. They can only create temporary jobs. Only a balanced economy can create the demand necessary for growth in our economy. And a balanced economy can only be achieved by our currency issuing government, who is mandated to mint and tax to provide for the general welfare and common defense thereof, to ensure domestic tranquility, which it can always do by buying up all unemployment with a federally guaranteed living wage job program for everyone who wants one. All right, to rebuild our crumbling communities across America in green and sustainable ways, to meet everybody's base needs in the public sector for free, to raise everybody's standard of living in America without raising taxes, without making cuts. All right, that, public debt for society and a higher standard of living is the entire point of socially owned government and dollars to begin with. Not to make profit for the capitalist class. We need to wake up in this country and start to understand what's going on so that we could fight back effectively, so that we could participate in our democracy effectively. And the only way you do that is by learning our operational reality. And then, forcing people to confront that reality, take a position. And then they start to, ask themselves, they start to re-examine their previously held positions and beliefs, now based on that reality. And now it's not so easy to become indifferent to pointless human suffering and death, because now you got that seed of truth in your brain, And that's how we overcome. That's how we're going to unite the masses. That's why I say MMT is a revolutionary vehicle we've all been waiting for. It unites all sides in solidarity for the public purpose, first and foremost, as mandated by our Constitution. But anyway, so they say the market ensures everyone gets what they deserve. Who cares if children have to starve and die? Who cares if people have to suffer and die of treatable, preventable illness because they don't have cash? Who cares if homeless people die of exposure while empty foreclosed houses are all over? Who cares? That's how these neoliberals think. That's our neoliberal status quo that we collectively accept, that we collectively rationalize, that we collectively deny. We buy into the mainstream lies and scare tactics that help us deny, that help us punch down, or help us rationalize away systemic abuse or evil conducted in our name. So we internalize and reproduce neoliberalism's creeds. The rich persuade themselves that they acquired their wealth through merit, ignoring advantages, such as education, inheritance, and class that may have helped to secure it. So, we internalize and reproduce its creeds of neoliberalism. The rich persuade themselves that they acquired their wealth through merit, ignoring their advantages, such as education, inheritance, and class. That may have helped to secure it, if you ask me. The poor begin to blame themselves for their failures, even when they can do little to change their circumstance. Again, that's it says, never mind structural unemployment. That's exactly what I was just talking about. In this neoliberal system, they make us feel, less than because we demand our public purpose as mandated by the Constitution. They make us feel like it's communism. And we're mooches just trying to be dependent on government. Wrong. We're all dependent on government. Always. If you have a job that pays dollars, you're dependent on federal spending. Always. To maintain that paid employment. Federal taxation creates unemployment, so government can provision society, and only federal spending satisfies that unemployment with paid employment. So we're all dependent on government. And if government creates unemployment, it's government's duty to maintain true full employment for that same general welfare, because it would never be in the public interest to target any number of unemployed, let alone 5%, and keep forcing millions of people to be unemployed and poor. And it's especially sadistic when you consider we have work all over America that's not getting done. And it's essential to the general welfare. Communities crumbling, people drinking poison water, schools understaffed, bridges crumbling. And we're forcing millions to be unemployed and poor. That's untapped productive capacity. It's artificial scarcity that kills more than drugs and guns combined. And yet people will still buy into the narrative that we're in Syria for humanitarian reasons, just to help the oppressed people of Syria. Yeah, really. Since when does America care about oppressed people? Look around America. 60% of Americans don't even have a savings account. Okay, that's because our government is in class war, and we have starvation wage jobs. We live a precarious existence, over leveraged with private credit to our eyeballs, using credit cards for milk and eggs and school and transportation and housing and healthcare. You know, one mistake away from being destitute. That's how they got us. And in America, only in America, we feel proud of this. We feel proud of working ourselves to death. Like that's somehow integrity or something to be proud of. It's sickening. We need to wake up. We need to start standing up and speaking out for the oppressed amongst us. We need to start standing up and speaking out against tyrannical governments, or else nothing's going to change, okay? We're not over there bombing or in a proxy war with Assad because he's oppressing his people. We're in a proxy war with Assad because he treats his people too good. Okay, we don't want the public purpose. America is desperately spreads this for-profit imperialism and proxy wars to protect our for-profit way of life. So yet again, we see how the simple logic of our operational reality destroys these scare tactics that keep us accepting evil conducted in our name. All right. So it says, never mind the structural unemployment. If you don't have a job, it's because you're enterprising. Never mind the impossible cost of housing. If your credit card is maxed out, you're feckless and imprudent. Never mind that your children are no longer have a school playing field. If they get fat, it's your fault. In a world governed by competition, those who fall behind become defined by self-defined as losers. Among the results, as Paul Vegley documents in his book, What About Me, are epidemics of self-harm, eating disorders, depression, loneliness, performance anxiety, and social phobia. Perhaps it's unsurprising that Britain, in which neoliberal ideology has been the most rigorously applied, in the loneliness capital of Europe. We are all neoliberals now. I disagree with that. They have a national health service. We don't have that. We created neoliberalism in America and we export it worldwide. But the term neoliberalism was coined at a meeting in Paris in 1938. Among the delegates were two men who come to define the ideology, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, two economists. Both exiles from Austria, they saw social democracy exemplified by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the gradual development of Britain's welfare state, a manifestation of collectivism that occupied the same spectrum of Nazism and communism. See, just like I said, they see our Constitution and democracy as communism, as something that is evil. They think that if we feed the starving, that's somehow evil and we're going to lose our freedom. If we somehow stop people from suffering and dying of treatable, preventable illness, somehow, things are going to get worse for everybody, as opposed to letting people die and suffer of treatable, preventable illness over money. Come on, get real. This tortured logic needs to be destroyed, and it's easily destroyed with simple logic. I do it all the time. Every day I do it with someone. So in The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, Hayek argued that the government planning by crushing individualism would lead inexorably to totalitarianism control. Like Mises' book, Bureaucracy, The Road to Serfdom was widely read. It came to the attention of some very wealthy people who saw in the philosophy an opportunity to free themselves from regulation and tax. When in 1947, Hayek founded the first organization that would spread the doctrine of neoliberalism, the Montpellier Society. It was supported financially by millionaires and their foundations. With their help, he began to create with what Daniel Steinman Jones describes in Masters of the Universe as a kind of neoliberal international, a transatlantic network of academics, businessmen, journalists, and activists. The movement's rich backers funded a series of think tanks which would refine and promote the ideology. Among them were American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Center for Policy Studies, and the Adam Smith Institute. They also financed academic positions and departments, particularly at the universities of Chicago and Virginia. So these neoliberals bought up whole departments, economic departments in schools, okay, and they only allowed free market capitalism to be studied. They shunned Marx and all other heterodox economic thinking. They didn't allow it to grow. So as it evolved, neoliberalism became more strident. Hayek's view that government should regulate competition to prevent monopolies from forming gave way among American apostles such as Milton Friedman to the belief that monopoly power could be seen as a reward for efficiency. So something else happened during this transition. The movement lost its name. In 1951, Friedman was happy to describe himself as a neoliberal, but soon after that, the term began to disappear. Stranger still, even after the ideology became crisper and the movement became more coherent, the lost name was not replaced by any common alternative. At first, despite its lavish funding, neoliberalism remained at the margins. The post-war consensus was almost universal. John Maynard Keynes' economic prescriptions were widely applied. Full employment and the relief of poverty were the common goals in the U.S. So you hear that? At first, neoliberalism, it was in the margins, okay? In the post-war consensus was almost universal. John Maynard Keynes' economic prescriptions were widely applied. Full employment and the relief of poverty were common goals in the U.S. and much of Western Europe. Top rates of tax were high, and government sought social outcomes without embarrassment. Governments sought social outcomes without embarrassment, developing new public services and safety nets, as is their job. But in the 1970s, when Keynesian policies began to fall apart and economic crisis struck on both sides of the Atlantic, neoliberal ideas began to enter into the mainstream. As Friedman remarked, when the time came that you had to change, there has to be an alternative ready to be picked up. With the help of sympathetic journalists and political advisors, elements of neoliberalism, especially its prescriptions for the monetary policy, were adopted by Jimmy Carter's administration in the U.S. and Jim Callahan's government in Britain. It may seem strange that a doctrine promising choice should have been promoted with the slogan, "There is no alternative." After Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan took power, the rest of the package soon followed. Massive tax cuts for the rich, the crushing of trade unions, deregulation, privatization, outsourcing and competition in public services. Through the IMF, the World Bank, and the Maastricht Treaty, the World Trade Organization, neoliberal policies were imposed, often without democratic consent, on much of the world. Most remarkably was its adaptation among parties that once belonged to the left. Labor and the Democrats, for example, are now neoliberals, right-wing neoliberals. As Stedman Jones notes, it's hard to think about another utopia to have been as fully realized as the neoliberal utopia envision. It may seem strange that a doctrine promising choice should have been promoted with such a slogan, "There is no alternative," but as Hayek remarked on a visit to Pinochet's Chile, one of the first nations in which the program was comprehensively applied. Okay, so you hear that. This is our neoliberal, our right-wing neoliberal status quo, who Hayek and Milton Friedman of the Chicago School were the creators of. They were the right-wing dictators, mass murderer, Pinochet. He was their example of what a perfect neoliberal society should be. That's what he says. He went down there to Pinochet's Chile, and he remarked on a visit to that nation, one of the first nations in which the neoliberal program was comprehensively applied. My personal preference leans toward a liberal dictatorship rather than toward a democratic government devoid of liberalism. The freedom of the freedom that neoliberalism offers, which sounds so beguiling when expressed in general terms, turns out to mean freedom for the pike, not for the minnows. Freedom from trade unions, freedom from collective bargaining means the freedom to suppress wages, like I was just saying. Freedom from regulation means freedom to poison our rivers and our air and food and endanger workers, charging iniquitous rates of interest and design exotic financial instruments. Freedom from tax means freedom from the distribution of wealth that lifts people out of poverty. See, and this is where the author falls into the neoliberal frame without even realizing it. Thinking that, tax is a way to redistribute wealth when it's not. Taxes are destroyed upon receipt. Taxes do serve functions, but they never fund the government. They never fund taxes. They never fund spending because you can't even collect a tax until government first spends dollars. So that, as Naomi Klein's documents in the shock doctrine, neoliberal theorists advanced the use of crisis to impose unpopular policies while people were distracted. For example, in the aftermath of Pinochet's coup, the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, which Friedman describes as an opportunity to radically reform the educational system in New Orleans. See, they use these things. They use all these other people's misfortune to keep us divided and distracted. When neoliberal policies cannot be imposed domestically, they are imposed internationally through trade treaties incorporating investor-state dispute settlement, offshore tribunals in which corporations could press for the removal of social and environmental protections in a local host nation. When parliaments have voted to restrict sales of cigarettes, protect water supplies from mining companies, freeze energy bills, or prevent pharmaceutical firms from ripping off the state, corporations have sued and often been successful. Democracy is reduced to theater. Neoliberalism was not conceived as a self-serving racket, but it rapidly became one. Another paradox of neoliberalism is the universal competition relies upon universal quantification of comparison. The result is that workers, job seekers, and public services of every kind are subject to pettifogging, sifting regime of assessment and monitoring designed to identify the winners and the losers and punish the losers. The doctrine that von Mises proposed would free us from the bureaucratic nightmare of central planning, has instead created one. So, the neoliberal doctrine of von Mises proposed would free us from bureaucratic nightmare of the state and central planning, has actually created a bureaucratic nightmare, a corporate bureaucratic nightmare that's not democratically elected and that only serves the purpose of profit. So corporate bureaucracy is always worse than government bureaucracy. Neoliberalism was not conceived as a self-serving racket, but it rapidly became one. Economic growth has been marked slower in the neoliberal era. Neoliberalism was not conceived. Hold on, I'm going to put this meme up for everyone to see because this is what it's talking about. Whoops. Okay. Economic growth has been markedly slower in the neoliberal area since the 1980s in Britain and the U.S., actually since about 73. Our wages stopped going up with our production. That's what fosters these starvation wages and the pay gap that you see in the chart, which becomes a spending gap. People don't have money to spend and buy, so they are forced into credit. So, and then it was in the process preceding decades, but not for the very rich. Inequality in the distribution of both income and wealth. Inequality in the distribution of both income and wealth after 60 years of decline rose rapidly in this era due to the smashing of trade unions like the full employment policies of the New Deal, tax reductions, rising rents, and privatization and deregulation. That's neoliberalism in a nutshell. And this is the wage suppression that results. That's class warfare. All right, that makes us a precarious existence, dysfunctional and violent at the bottom, dog eat dog. That's not how you get the domestic tranquility as mandated by our Constitution. The privatization and marketization of public services such as energy, water, trains, health, education, roads, and prisons has enabled corporations to set up toll booths in front of essential assets and charge rent, either to citizens or to government for their use. Rent is another term for unearned income. When you pay an inflated price for a train ticket, only part of the fare compensates the operators for the money they spent on fuel, wages, and rolling stock and other outlays. The rest reflects the fact that they have you over a barrel. So when you pay on an inflated price for a train ticket, only part of the fare compensates the operations for the money they spend on fuel, wages, and rolling stock of other outlays. The rest reflects the fact that they have you over a barrel. Those who own and run the UK's privatized and semi-privatized services make stupendous fortunes by investing little and charging much. In Russia and India, oligarchs acquired state assets through fire sales. In Mexico, Carlos Slim was granted control of almost all landline and mobile phone services and soon became the world's richest man. Financialization, as Andrew Sayer notes, and why we can't afford the rich, has a similar impact. Like rent, he argues, interest is unearned income that acquires without any effort. As the poor become poorer and the rich become richer, the rich acquire increasing increasing control over another crucial asset, money. Interest payments overwhelmingly are a transfer of money from the poor to the rich. As property prices and the withdrawal of state funding load people with debt, think of the switch from student grants to student loans, the banks and their executives clean up. I mean, right now, they starve our economy of public spending. They starve it of dollars, starve it of deficit spending, targeting unemployment to force us into private credit like this. And it's not just student loans, it's credit cards for eggs and milk, credit for healthcare, credit for everything. Sayer argues the past 4 decades have been characterized by a transfer of wealth not only from the poor to the rich, but within the ranks of the wealthy, from those who make their money by producing new goods or services to those who make their money by controlling existing assets and harvesting rent, interest, or capital gains. Earned income has been supplanted by unearned income. Neoliberal policies are everywhere, beset by market failures. Not only are the banks too big to fail, but so are the corporations now charged with delivering public services. As Tony Jun pointed out, Hayek forgot that vital national services cannot be allowed to collapse, which means that competition cannot run its course. Okay, business takes the profits and the state keeps the risk. So what they're saying is the markets really have no business in essential public goods because there's no government doesn't need profit, and so the natural business cycle doesn't apply. Okay, there is no ebbs and flows, and it can't be allowed to collapse because it's an essential public good that's required for the domestic tranquility. So this is why it should never be privatized. We should never be privatizing the public space. This all describes our right-wing government, by the way, which is why we team up with right-wing proxies around the world against leftist movements, which is why you can say with certainty that, the white helmets are just another one of those right-wing proxies against another leftist government in Syria with their democratic constitution. Thanks a lot, and take it easy. This is how we affect change. This is how we unite all sides in solidarity for the public purpose first and foremost. We got to keep interjecting the truth and logic of our simple logic, of our operational reality, to destroy people's delusions, make them confront our reality, the brutality of our reality, make them answer for systemic abuse and evil carried out in our name. Don't let them ignore it. Don't let them rationalize that away. Don't let them become indifferent to pointless human suffering and death. This is our job. It's everyone's moral and civic obligation to participate in our democracy, to help self-govern. Okay, the only way you could do that effectively is by learning our operational reality. All right, and then teaching it. Each one teach one. We are the revolution. Understand our public purpose. Balance the economy, not the budget. Okay, this is how we're going to affect change. Thanks, guys. Take it easy.